something we spent a lot of time on first semester was the concept of elasticity. We talked about how demand and supply curves don't always have to look like the sort of ideal 45-degree angle curves that we generally draw when we don't have numbers. In fact, the different shapes of or slopes of demand and supply curves, as well as especially for the demand curve, the different points on the specific demand curve can tell us a lot about the products. And that's where we get into this concept of elasticity. And elasticity always measures for us the change in one variable to a change in another variable. And in microeconomics, it's always the change in a quantity to a change in the price. And so the main one, the one that's going to show up a bunch in the multiple choice on the AP exam, is the elasticity of demand. So if we're measuring the demand for a product and we want to know certain things about that demand, we can measure the percent change in the quantity demanded divided by the percent change in the price of that good. Now we're going to always take the absolute value because these two things, one is always going to be negative, one is always going to be positive because of the law of demand. So we take the absolute value to get just a regular number. And if that is less than 1, the result here is less than 1, that tells us the product is inelastic, meaning it's a good that we need. It's a necessity. It's something that is needed for daily life. And we talked about how a great example of that is insulin, right? If we are diabetic, then we always need insulin. So that's actually over here at 0 would be perfectly inelastic. And we might also call this relatively inelastic. If it is greater than 1, then it's relatively elastic. It's not a good that we need. It's a good that we choose to consume. So the example we used heavily in class was something like bicycles. It's nice to have a bicycle, but there's substitutes for bicycles. There's other things you could do instead. You could walk, you could take a bus, and so it's relatively elastic. And a good that if the price were to change even a little bit, you might either stop buying it or you would start buying a ton of it. That would be something that's approaching perfectly elastic. Now, in general, a perfectly inelastic demand curve is vertical, right? I for inelastic. A perfectly elastic demand curve is horizontal, sort of making it, if we had a third line, an E for elastic. Right in the middle is unit elastic. Now that more comes into play when we're talking about elasticity along a demand curve. And when we get into monopoly, we talk about points on the demand curve up for a monopoly, we'll come back and talk about unit elasticity and what that tells us about total revenue. So for example, let's do a problem relating to elasticity of demand. Let's say the price of a good goes up by 10%. And as a result, the quantity you buy of that good is going to go down, but it only goes down by 5%. So if we take the absolute value there, then it's 1/2, which means that's an inelastic good. That's a good that we must need even if the price changes. Let's go to another form of elasticity, and these other forms, they might pop up a couple times on the multiple choice. I've seen them on the FRQs recently as well. The first one is cross-price elasticity of demand, or measuring the percent change in quantity of one good divided by the percent change in price of the second good. And this tells us whether goods are complements or substitutes. So if this is negative, then the goods are complements, meaning you need them together, hot dogs and buns. If it's greater than 0, then they're substitutes, meaning you don't need both of them, you're gonna have one or the other. That would be hot dogs and hamburgers. So for example, let's say the price of good Y goes down by 25%. As a result, the quantity of good X that you buy goes down by 10%, meaning a big drop in price in good Y means you're going to buy less of good X. To me, even without doing the math, that tells me they're substitutes, but the math also tells me that it is, if I can do it right, 2/5 that they're substitutes. The next one is income elasticity, and it is exactly what it sounds like. It measures how much the change in how much we want to buy, the quantity demanded of a good, changes if our income changes. And this tells us if goods are normal or inferior. If this comes out to be less than 0 or a negative number, then the good is inferior. That's a good that you're going to buy more of when you have less income. If it's greater than 0, then it's going to be normal. But if it's greater than 1, it's both normal and a luxury. So if it's between 0 and 1, then it's probably normal and a necessity. Like you need clothing, it doesn't matter what kind of clothing, so that's a normal good and a necessity, right? If it's certain kind of clothes, then it might be a luxury, so there's a range in what a normal good can be. So if your income goes down, negative 5%, and you choose to buy 15% more of a good, well, what does that tell you about the good? That tells you that the income elasticity is -3, which means it's an inferior good. It's something you're going to buy more of when you have less income. So a can of beans, right, rather than fresher fruits and vegetables. The last one is elasticity of supply. We don't need to spend a lot of time on this because it is the same formula as we've done before, and it's exactly the same analysis as we did for elasticity of demand. If it is less than 1, it's inelastic. If it's greater than 1, it's elastic. Importantly though, in this case, it refers to whether or not, if the price we can sell the good for changes, whether or not we will supply the same amount or we will change the amount we're supplying. If it's inelastic, that means we have a hard time changing how much we produce of the good. So if it's inelastic and the price changes, we're kind of stuck producing the same amount. So let's say we've turned our factory on and then the market for cars collapses. Well, we've already started the factory. It's hard to stop something like that. On the other hand, if you make ice cream and the weather goes bad, then the price is going to have to go down, but you're also going to say, you know what, I'm going to stop making ice cream, you start making hot chocolate instead. Then you have elastic supply. So importantly, for the AP exam, you need to have these 4 formulas locked in your brain, especially the first one. Because if you can remember the first one, the other 3 follow the same sort of analysis, but also it's always a quantity change over a % change in price.